From the outside, Daniel Harper's life looked almost too ordinary to attract attention. He lived in a modest two-story home on a quiet street lined with maple trees, where children rode bicycles in the evenings and neighbors waved from their driveways as they carried groceries inside. Daniel worked as an accountant for a regional construction company, a job that required long hours during tax season but gave him enough stability to provide for his family. His wife, Vanessa, had once been the bright center of his world. She had a confident smile, a sharp sense of humor, and a way of making every room feel more alive when she entered it. When they first met at a friend's engagement party, Daniel had been drawn to her energy immediately. She spoke easily with everyone, laughed loudly without caring who noticed, and made Daniel feel as though he had finally found someone who understood the quiet parts of him that most people overlooked. For years, he believed their marriage was built on that understanding. Their son, Ethan, was born 4 years after their wedding, and for a while, Daniel convinced himself that their family had become everything he had ever wanted. Ethan had Daniel's thoughtful eyes and Vanessa's dark hair, and from the moment he could walk, he seemed to fill every corner of the house with movement and questions. Daniel remembered waking early on Saturday mornings to make pancakes, while Ethan stood on a chair beside the kitchen counter, carefully stirring batter with both hands. Vanessa would often come downstairs later, still wearing her robe, smiling at the sight of them covered in flour. She would take pictures on her phone and send them to her sister, Claire, with captions about her 2 favorite boys. Those were the moments Daniel held on to whenever he felt the first signs of distance growing between them. He wanted to believe those photographs captured the truth of their family, not just the version Vanessa wanted other people to see. Vanessa had always cared deeply about appearances. She wanted the house clean before anyone visited, even if it meant staying up late rearranging furniture after Ethan had gone to bed. She wanted Daniel to wear nicer shirts to family dinners with her father, Richard, a retired businessman who had strong opinions about nearly everything. She wanted Ethan to attend the best schools, join the right activities, and behave in a way that made people compliment her parenting. At first, Daniel saw this as ambition. He admired how determined she was to create a good life for them. But over time, her concern with appearances became something heavier. It was no longer enough for their family to be happy. They had to look happy at all times. If Daniel came home tired and forgot to smile when Vanessa took a photo, she would accuse him of embarrassing her. If Ethan spilled juice on the carpet before guests arrived, Vanessa's face would tighten with anger, though she would quickly soften her voice the moment the doorbell rang. The change did not happen all at once. Daniel could not point to one argument, one cruel sentence, or one difficult day and say that was when their marriage began to break apart. Instead, it came in small moments that were easy to dismiss. Vanessa would criticize the way he folded laundry, the way he spoke to Ethan, the way he handled money, even the way he sat quietly after dinner. She began telling him that he was too passive, too boring, too weak to make decisions for the family. When Daniel tried to explain that he was simply tired from work, she would laugh and say he always had an excuse. Sometimes she said these things when Ethan was in the room, pretending to be focused on his homework or a video game. But Daniel could see his son's shoulders tense each time Vanessa's voice changed. Daniel would try to keep his own voice calm, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew Ethan was watching. As the years passed, Vanessa started rewriting ordinary events into proof that Daniel was failing them. If he worked late, she told Ethan that his father cared more about numbers than family. If he took a day off to attend one of Ethan's school events, she would say he was only trying to look like a good dad in front of other people. When Daniel bought Ethan a used bicycle for his birthday, Vanessa complained that he had chosen something cheap because he did not value his son enough. Yet when Daniel suggested saving for a better bike, she accused him of being selfish with money. Nothing he did seemed to be enough because Vanessa did not want solutions. She wanted control over the story their family told, and Daniel was slowly becoming the villain in that story. At family gatherings, Vanessa's father, Richard, often treated Daniel with quiet disappointment. He would ask about Daniel's job in a tone that suggested accounting was not a real career, then turn to Ethan and tell him that boys needed strong men to guide them. Claire, Vanessa's younger sister, was kinder on the surface, but rarely challenged Vanessa when she made cutting remarks. Daniel began noticing how Vanessa would tell them selective versions of their arguments, leaving out her own words and making him sound cold or careless. By the end of the evening, Richard would look at Daniel as though he had personally failed his daughter, while Vanessa sat beside them with a wounded expression that made everyone believe she was carrying the weight of the family alone. Daniel kept trying to repair what was breaking. He suggested counseling, planned quiet dinners, took Ethan on weekend trips, and made an effort to speak to Vanessa with patience, even when she spoke to him with contempt. He told himself that marriage was difficult and that every family went through seasons of stress. But inside their home, the silence between arguments became more frightening than the arguments themselves, because Daniel could feel Ethan learning how to disappear whenever Vanessa was unhappy. The boy who once filled the house with questions began speaking more softly, closing his bedroom door more often, and watching both of his parents with an expression far too serious for his age. Vanessa's behavior changed most when no one else was around to see it. In public, she remained polished and charming, the kind of mother who remembered every teacher's name, brought homemade snacks to school events, and smiled warmly whenever someone complimented Ethan. She posted family photos online with captions about gratitude, love, and how proud she was of her husband and son. Friends often told Daniel that he was lucky to have such a devoted wife. Even his own co-workers spoke highly of Vanessa after meeting her at holiday parties, impressed by the way she held conversations and made everyone feel important. Daniel never corrected them. He had learned that explaining the truth would only make him sound bitter, and Vanessa had already become skilled at making him appear unreasonable whenever he tried to defend himself. Behind the closed doors of their home, however, her voice became colder, sharper, and more deliberate. She no longer argued simply because she was frustrated. She chose her words carefully, as though every sentence had been designed to leave a mark. At first, Vanessa's criticism was aimed only at Daniel. She would wait until Ethan was nearby, then make comments that sounded casual, but carried a clear message. "Your father forgot again," she would say when Daniel came home late from work. "I guess some things matter more to him than his own family." If Daniel tried to explain that he had been delayed by a meeting, Vanessa would shake her head and turn to Ethan as if she were speaking only to him. "You'll understand one day. Adults make promises they don't keep." Daniel would stand there, still holding his briefcase, feeling the weight of every word settle into the room. He knew Ethan was listening, even when the boy kept his eyes on the floor. He could see the confusion in his son's face, the quiet struggle between what Ethan knew from his own experiences and what his mother was telling him to believe. Vanessa became especially cruel whenever Daniel tried to spend time alone with Ethan. If Daniel took him fishing on a Saturday morning, Vanessa would complain that he was trying to turn Ethan against her. If they went to the park, she would accuse Daniel of making decisions without consulting her. If Ethan came home laughing after a father-son movie night, Vanessa would find a reason to ruin the mood. She would ask why Daniel had spent money without asking her, why Ethan had eaten popcorn instead of a healthy dinner, or why they had come home later than expected. Then, after Daniel left the room, she would speak to Ethan in a low voice. "Your father thinks he can buy your love," she once said. "Don't let him fool you." Ethan did not answer, but Daniel noticed that after that night, his son stopped talking as freely about the things they did together. The manipulation grew more direct as Ethan got older. Vanessa began asking him questions that did not feel like questions at all. "Does your dad ever scare you?" she would ask while folding laundry. "Do you feel safe when he gets angry?" Ethan would look confused because Daniel rarely raised his voice, but Vanessa would not let the silence remain. "You can tell me the truth," she would continue. "I know he gets frustrated. I know he says things he shouldn't." When Ethan said that Daniel did not scare him, Vanessa would sigh heavily and tell him he was too young to understand. She made him feel guilty for defending his father, as though loyalty to Daniel was a betrayal of her. Over time, Ethan began giving shorter answers, trying to avoid the questions altogether, but Vanessa always found a way to return to them. She also began using tears as a weapon. Whenever Ethan disagreed with her or asked her to stop talking badly about Daniel, Vanessa would suddenly become emotional. She would sit at the kitchen table with her hands over her face and say that no one appreciated how hard she worked for the family. She would remind Ethan that she had given up parts of her life to raise him, that she had stayed in a difficult marriage because she wanted him to have both parents, and that Daniel didn't understand how much she suffered. Ethan was only 11 when she first told him that his father might someday leave them with nothing. He was 12 when she told him Daniel was selfish. By 13, she had begun telling him that if he ever had to choose between his parents, he needed to remember who had always been there for him. Daniel noticed the change in Ethan long before he understood the cause. His son became cautious in ways that made Daniel's heart ache. Ethan would start telling a story, then stop halfway through and glance toward the hallway to make sure Vanessa was not listening. He would ask Daniel whether people could get in trouble for telling the truth. He began apologizing for small things that did not need apologies, like leaving a cup in the sink or forgetting to charge his phone. Daniel tried to reassure him, without making Ethan feel pressured to reveal what was happening. He knew that if he pushed too hard, Vanessa might accuse him of coaching their son. So he stayed calm. He listened carefully. He gave Ethan space. And each night, after Ethan went to bed, Daniel lay awake wondering how a child could be protected from words that no one else was willing to hear. Vanessa's father, Richard, only made the situation worse. He believed his daughter without question and often called Daniel to lecture him about being a better husband and father. He told Daniel that Vanessa was exhausted, that she was carrying the family, and that Daniel needed to stop making her unhappy. Claire sometimes called too, pretending she wanted to help, but her questions always seemed to come from things Vanessa had already told her. "Did you really yell at Ethan?" Claire asked one afternoon, sounding concerned. Daniel had not yelled at Ethan. "Vanessa says he was upset for hours." Daniel realized then that Vanessa was not only shaping Ethan's view of him, she was building a network of people who would repeat her version of events until it sounded like fact. One evening, Daniel came home early and heard Vanessa speaking to Ethan in the living room before she noticed him at the door. Her voice was low, but every word was clear. She told Ethan that his father was unstable, that he could not be trusted, and that someday Ethan might have to tell a judge what life was really like in their house. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, unable to believe what he was hearing. Ethan did not respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and uncertain. He asked his mother why she kept saying things that were not true. Ethan did not begin recording his mother because he wanted to expose her. He was not thinking about courtrooms, divorce papers, lawyers, or the kind of consequences adults feared when their private words became public. At 13, he only knew that something inside his home felt wrong, and that every time he tried to explain it, the truth seemed to slip away before anyone else could see it. Vanessa had become careful around other people. The moment Daniel entered the room, she could change her tone. The moment a relative called, she could sound tired and heartbroken instead of angry. At school meetings, she spoke about how worried she was for Ethan, how difficult it was to raise a child in a tense household, and how much she hoped Daniel would become more involved. People listened to her because she sounded convincing. She knew how to pause at the right moment, how to lower her eyes as if she were ashamed to speak badly about her husband, and how to make every accusation sound like a painful confession she had been forced to make. Ethan watched adults believe her again and again, and he began to understand that simply telling the truth was not always enough. The old phone had belonged to Daniel. It was a scratched, outdated device with a cracked corner and a battery that barely lasted through the day. Daniel had given it to Ethan for emergencies after buying a newer phone for work, telling him to keep it charged in his backpack whenever he walked home from school or went to a friend's house. Ethan rarely used it. He did not have many friends he visited after school, and he usually came straight home, where he would finish his homework at the kitchen table or sit quietly in his room. One afternoon, after Vanessa had spent nearly an hour telling him that Daniel would eventually abandon them, Ethan opened the phone and noticed the voice recording app. He stared at the small red circle on the screen for a long time. His hands were shaking when he pressed it for the first time, not because he thought he was doing something wrong, but because he felt as though he was finally holding on to something solid. That first recording was short. Vanessa had been standing near the sink, speaking in the same calm, poisonous tone she used when she wanted Ethan to doubt himself. She told him that Daniel was pretending to be kind because he knew Ethan was getting older and harder to control. She said that if Daniel ever asked Ethan questions about their family, he should be careful what he said, because his father might twist his words. Ethan kept the phone hidden in the pocket of his hoodie, the microphone barely visible beneath the fabric. He did not speak. He did not argue. He only listened while his mother built another version of reality around him. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, he sat on the floor of his room and listened to the recording through a pair of cheap earbuds. Hearing her voice played back to him made his stomach tighten. It was the same voice he had heard in the kitchen, but now it could not disappear. Now it existed outside his memory. After that day, Ethan began recording whenever he sensed that Vanessa was about to start. He did not do it every hour or every day. He was too afraid she would find out, and part of him still hoped she would stop on her own. But arguments had patterns, and Vanessa followed them almost perfectly. She would wait until Daniel was at work, then begin asking Ethan questions about his father. She would start with concern, asking whether Daniel had been acting strange, then move toward accusation, telling Ethan that his father was selfish, unstable, or dishonest. Some days, she pressured him to say that Daniel shouted at him. Other days, she told him that if he loved her, he would support her when the time came. She never fully explained what she meant by that, but Ethan understood enough to know that she was preparing him for something. Each recording became another piece of a story he did not want to be part of. He learned how to hide the phone in different places. Sometimes he placed it inside his backpack on the chair beside the kitchen table. Sometimes he left it under a cushion in the living room when Vanessa was speaking on the phone with Claire or Richard. Once, he tucked it behind a row of books on a shelf near the hallway, capturing Vanessa as she spoke to someone about how easy it would be to make Daniel look irresponsible. Ethan did not always understand the adult details, but he understood the meaning behind her words. She talked about custody. She talked about money. She talked about making sure Daniel could not turn people against her first. On several recordings, she told Claire that Ethan was beginning to question her, and Claire advised her to be more careful. Ethan listened to those conversations late at night. feeling older than he should have felt, realizing that the people around his mother were not trying to protect him from the conflict. They were helping her shape it. For nearly 3 years, Ethan carried the burden alone. He created folders on the old phone and gave them names that no one would question if they saw them: school notes, science project, math audio, and homework. Inside those folders were recordings from birthdays, holidays, weekday afternoons, and quiet nights when Daniel was working late. There were recordings of Vanessa telling Ethan that his father would ruin their lives. There were recordings of her telling Richard that Daniel had never touched her, but that she could make people believe he had been threatening. There were recordings of her telling Claire that Ethan needed to be on her side before she filed for divorce. There were even recordings of her laughing after family friends left the house, mocking the sympathy they had shown her. Each time Ethan saved another file, he felt relief mixed with guilt. He loved his mother, or at least he wanted to love the version of her he remembered from when he was younger. But the woman on those recordings did not sound like someone who wanted to protect him. Daniel noticed that Ethan had become unusually attached to the old phone, but he assumed it was because his son liked having something that belonged to him. Ethan kept it close even when it was charging, and he became anxious whenever Vanessa entered his room without knocking. Daniel never searched through his things. He believed Ethan deserved privacy, especially during a time when the house had become so tense. Instead, Daniel tried to be present in quieter ways. He asked Ethan about school, made dinner when Vanessa stayed late at her sister's house, and drove him to basketball practice even when he was exhausted from work. Sometimes Ethan would look as though he wanted to say something important, but then he would change the subject. Daniel could see the fear in him, but he did not know where it came from. The moment Ethan understood that the recordings might matter came during an argument between Vanessa and Daniel. Daniel had found a letter from a lawyer in the mailbox, and Vanessa finally admitted that she had been considering divorce for months. She accused him of emotional abuse, financial control, and neglecting Ethan. Daniel looked stunned, not angry. He asked her why she was saying things that were not true, but Vanessa only turned toward Ethan and said, "Tell him. Tell him how he makes this house feel." Ethan stood in the doorway with the old phone hidden in his pocket, his thumb resting over the record button as his mother waited for him to repeat the lies she had planted for years. The letter from Vanessa's lawyer changed the atmosphere in the Harper house overnight. Although Daniel had known for months that something was coming, he had felt it in the way Vanessa began taking private calls in the garage, lowering her voice whenever he entered the room, and leaving the house dressed more formally than usual without explaining where she was going. He had seen the folders she kept locked in the desk drawer of her home office, and he had noticed how often she spoke with her father, Richard, late at night. Still, seeing the legal papers in his hands made everything feel more real than he was prepared for. Vanessa had not simply asked for a divorce. She had asked for the house, primary custody of Ethan, child support, and restrictions on Daniel's time with his son. The document described Daniel as emotionally volatile, financially controlling, and distant from Ethan's daily life. It claimed that Vanessa had spent years trying to keep the family together, while Daniel created an unsafe and unstable environment. Daniel read every sentence twice, then a third time, hoping that somehow the words would change into something less cruel. Vanessa stood across the kitchen from him with her arms folded, her expression calm in a way that made Daniel feel as though she had rehearsed the moment. She told him that she had tried to make things work, but she could not continue living with someone who made her feel afraid. Daniel asked her when he had ever made her afraid. He asked her to name one moment when he had threatened her, insulted her, or made her feel unsafe. Vanessa did not answer directly. Instead, she said that abuse was not always physical, and that he should stop pretending he did not know what he had done. Her words were carefully chosen, vague enough to avoid details, but serious enough to make him question how anyone else would hear them. Ethan was standing near the hallway, holding his backpack after returning from school, and Daniel immediately lowered his voice. He did not want his son trapped in another argument. Vanessa noticed this and gave a small, bitter smile, as though his calmness was proof that he was hiding something. Within days, Richard became deeply involved. He arrived at the house without calling first, walking through the front door as if he still had the right to manage his daughter's life. He spoke to Daniel in the living room while Vanessa sat beside him, quiet and wounded-looking. Richard told Daniel that he had failed Vanessa, failed Ethan, and failed to understand what a husband was supposed to be. He said that Vanessa had carried the marriage for years, while Daniel hid behind his job and his silence. Daniel tried to explain that silence had become the only way to avoid making arguments worse, but Richard dismissed him before he could finish. He said that men like Daniel always acted calm when they were caught, that they made women look emotional so no one would believe them. Daniel realized then that Richard had already decided who he was. Nothing he said would matter because Vanessa had been telling her father a version of the story for so long that Richard no longer needed proof. Claire's involvement was quieter, but just as damaging. She began appearing at the house more often, claiming she was there to support Vanessa and help with Ethan. She would bring groceries, sit with Vanessa in the kitchen, and speak in hushed voices whenever Daniel walked past. At first, Daniel tried to remain polite, even when Claire looked at him with suspicion. But he soon discovered that she had been helping Vanessa organize messages, screenshots, and notes that were meant to support her claims. Claire had saved texts from Daniel that were completely ordinary, then highlighted certain words to make them sound harsh. A message saying, "I can't talk right now, I'm in a meeting," became evidence that Daniel ignored Vanessa. A message saying, "We need to discuss our budget," became proof that he controlled money. Daniel began to understand that Vanessa was not only relying on memories or emotions. She was building a case, carefully selecting pieces of their life and rearranging them until they looked like something they were not. Daniel hired an attorney named Marcus Hale after a co-worker quietly recommended him. Marcus was not dramatic or overly reassuring. He listened to Daniel describe the situation, asked careful questions, and requested copies of every document Vanessa's lawyer had filed. When Daniel finished explaining that he had never abused Vanessa or neglected Ethan, Marcus nodded slowly and told him that divorce cases often became battles over perception. He said that the court would not decide based on who sounded more emotional or who had the most relatives willing to take sides. It would look for consistency, evidence, and the best interests of Ethan. Daniel wanted to believe him, but the legal process felt overwhelming. Every form seemed to ask him to defend his character. Every accusation made him feel as though he had to prove that he was not the man Vanessa described. Marcus advised him to stay calm, avoid private confrontations, communicate in writing whenever possible, and never speak badly about Vanessa in front of Ethan. The hardest part was watching Ethan become more withdrawn as the divorce moved forward. Vanessa began speaking openly about court dates, lawyers, and custody arrangements as if Ethan were not in the room. She told him that he might have to talk to people about what life was like with Daniel. She told him that he should not be scared to tell the truth, but the way she said it made the word truth feel like a threat. Sometimes she would place a hand on his shoulder and remind him that she had always been there for him. Other times, she would tell him that Daniel was trying to take him away from her. Ethan stopped eating much at dinner. He started spending longer hours in his room. Daniel would knock softly on his door and ask whether he wanted to talk, but Ethan usually said he was fine. Daniel knew he was not fine. He could see it in the tiredness around his eyes and the way he kept checking that the old phone in his pocket was still there. The first hearing was scheduled for a cold Monday morning in late November. The courthouse was crowded with people carrying folders, whispering to attorneys, and waiting for their names to be called. Vanessa arrived wearing a dark blue dress and a composed expression, with Richard and Claire seated behind her for support. Daniel sat at the opposite table beside Marcus, wearing the same grey suit he had worn to Ethan's middle school graduation. He had barely slept the night before. His hands were steady only because he kept them folded tightly in his lap beneath the table. Ethan sat behind him, unusually quiet, with his backpack resting against his feet. When Vanessa's attorney began describing Daniel as a controlling and emotionally abusive husband, Daniel felt each accusation land like a blow. He wanted to stand up and deny everything. He wanted to tell the judge about the years of manipulation, the conversations Ethan had been forced to endure, and the way Vanessa had turned ordinary family moments into weapons against him. Marcus placed a hand lightly on Daniel's arm, reminding him without words to remain calm. The judge listened carefully as Vanessa's attorney spoke about fear, instability, and a child caught between two parents. Vanessa wiped away tears at the right moments, never looking directly at Daniel for too long. Richard sat behind her with his jaw clenched, while Claire held Vanessa's hand as though she were comforting someone who had survived something terrible. Then the judge asked whether there was any additional evidence either side wished to present before the hearing continued, and the courtroom became still as Ethan slowly reached for his backpack. Ethan's hand remained inside his backpack for several seconds, gripping the old phone so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. From where Daniel sat, he could see his son's face reflected faintly in the polished surface of the courtroom table. Ethan looked frightened, but there was something else beneath the fear, a kind of exhausted determination that Daniel had never seen in him before. For years, Ethan had stayed quiet while the adults around him argued, accused one another, and made decisions about his life as though he were not there. He had watched his mother shape every conversation to make herself look helpless. He had watched his father absorb every insult without shouting back. Now, in the middle of a courtroom filled with strangers, lawyers, and family members who had already chosen sides, Ethan seemed to understand that silence would no longer protect anyone. Marcus noticed Ethan reaching into the bag and turned toward him with a questioning expression. Daniel followed his attorney's gaze, then saw the old phone in Ethan's hand. At first, he did not understand why his son had brought it. The device was scratched and worn, with a cracked corner Daniel recognized immediately. It had been sitting around the house for years before he gave it to Ethan for emergencies. Daniel assumed Ethan had brought it because teenagers carried phones everywhere, but the way Ethan held it made it clear that it was more than that. Ethan leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Dad, I need them to hear something." Daniel felt his chest tighten. He wanted to ask what Ethan meant, but Marcus raised one hand gently, signaling for him to wait. The judge looked toward Ethan after noticing the movement behind Daniel's chair. Her expression softened when she saw the boy standing beside his father's table. She asked whether he wished to speak. Ethan swallowed hard before answering. His voice was quiet at first, but it became steadier as he continued. He said that he did not want to choose between his parents. He said he loved both of them, but he could not keep pretending that everything his mother had said about Daniel was true. Vanessa's face changed immediately. The tears she had carefully held in her eyes disappeared, replaced by a sharp look of warning. She told Ethan to sit down, saying he was confused and upset because of the divorce. But Ethan did not move. He looked at the judge instead and explained that he had recordings from home, recordings he had made because he was afraid no one would believe him. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa's attorney stood quickly and objected, arguing that the recordings had not been reviewed, authenticated, or properly submitted as evidence. Marcus did not argue loudly. He asked the judge for permission to review the files and requested a brief recess if necessary. The judge studied Ethan for a long moment, then looked at Daniel and Marcus. She said that because the case involved allegations affecting Ethan's safety and custody, she would allow the recordings to be examined before making any decision. Vanessa's attorney protested again, but the judge's voice remained firm. She ordered both legal teams to meet privately with the court clerk and review the material. During the recess, Vanessa tried to speak to Ethan near the hallway outside the courtroom. Daniel saw her move toward him with her hand extended, her expression suddenly gentle again. She told him that he did not understand what he was doing. She said that the recordings were private family matters and that he was going to hurt everyone. Ethan stepped back. For the first time in years, he did not look down when his mother spoke. He told her that she had always said he needed to tell the truth. Vanessa's face tightened, and Daniel saw Richard move toward them, ready to intervene. Marcus stepped between them calmly and asked that Ethan remain with his father until the hearing resumed. Richard glared at Daniel as though he had planned the entire moment, but Daniel said nothing. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and guided him toward a quieter corner of the hallway.
When the hearing continued, Marcus informed the judge that the recordings appeared to contain multiple conversations over several years. He explained that they included Vanessa speaking directly to Ethan about Daniel, discussing plans with Claire and Richard, and making statements that contradicted the allegations she had filed in court. The judge asked whether there was one recording that could be played first to establish relevance. Marcus selected a file Ethan had marked with a date from several months earlier, shortly before Vanessa filed for divorce. The clerk connected the phone to the courtroom audio system. For a moment, there was only a faint crackle from the old recording. Then Vanessa's voice filled the room. She was speaking to Claire. Her tone was relaxed, almost amused. She said that Daniel was too calm to defend himself properly, and that people always believed the person who cried first. Claire asked whether Ethan would support her in court. Vanessa laughed softly and said that Ethan did not have a choice because she had been preparing him for years. She said that if he refused to say Daniel scared him, she would remind him how much she had sacrificed for him. The recording continued with Vanessa admitting that Daniel had never hit her and had never threatened her, but saying that emotional accusations were easier because no one could prove what happened inside a home. Every word echoed through the courtroom with a clarity that made Daniel feel as though the walls themselves had turned against the lies. Vanessa's attorney tried to stop the recording, but the judge raised her hand and instructed the clerk to continue. The next portion captured Vanessa speaking directly to Ethan in the kitchen. Her voice was lower, but unmistakable. She told him that when the judge asked questions, he needed to remember how scary Daniel could be. Ethan's younger voice asked, "But Dad doesn't scare me." Vanessa replied that he did not understand what was best for him and that good sons protected their mothers. The recording ended with Ethan asking why she wanted him to say things that were not true. No one spoke when the audio stopped. Richard stared at the floor. Claire sat frozen beside Vanessa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Vanessa herself looked as though she had forgotten how to breathe. Marcus then played another recording, this one from a phone call between Vanessa and Richard. In it, Richard asked whether Daniel had ever been violent. Vanessa answered that he had not, but she said that did not matter if they could convince the court he was unstable. Richard's voice became quieter as he told her to be careful, warning that false accusations could become a problem if Daniel had proof. Vanessa replied that Daniel was too trusting to keep proof of anything. She said he would never expect Ethan to be the one listening. Daniel looked at his son then, and Ethan's eyes were filled with tears. Daniel wanted to tell him that he should never have had to carry such a burden, but he remained still, knowing that this was Ethan's moment to finally be heard. By the time the third recording ended, the courtroom no longer felt like the place Vanessa had expected it to be. The story she had built for years had begun to collapse under the weight of her own voice, and every person who had believed her without question was forced to hear the truth in a way they could not explain away. After the recordings were played, the judge did not make an immediate decision. She ordered a full review of the audio files, requested that both attorneys submit additional documentation, and appointed a child advocate to speak privately with Ethan. Vanessa's attorney tried to argue that the recordings had been taken out of context, but the damage had already been done. There was no simple explanation for Vanessa's own voice, admitting that Daniel had never threatened her, never harmed her, and never made her afraid. There was no way to deny the pressure she had placed on Ethan or the conversations she had shared with Claire and Richard about making Daniel appear unstable. The courtroom had changed completely. Only an hour earlier, Daniel had been sitting quietly while strangers listened to a version of him that felt unrecognizable. Now, the truth was no longer something he carried alone. It had been heard by the judge, the attorneys, and the very people Vanessa had relied on to support her story. Outside the courtroom, Richard stood near the windows with his hands in his pockets, staring down at the street below. For the first time since the divorce began, he did not approach Daniel with accusations. His face looked older, and the confidence he had carried into the courthouse had faded. Claire remained beside Vanessa, but even she seemed unsure of what to say. Vanessa had always been the person who explained everything, the person who told them what had happened and who was responsible. Richard and Claire had believed her because she was family, because they trusted her tears, and because it was easier to see Daniel as the distant husband who had failed to appreciate her. But the recordings forced them to confront a painful possibility. They had helped Vanessa hurt a boy who had been trying to protect his father and himself. Daniel found Ethan sitting on a bench at the end of the hallway, holding the old phone in both hands. The courthouse was loud around them, filled with footsteps, closing doors, and voices from other hearings, but Ethan looked as though he could not hear any of it. Daniel sat beside him without speaking right away. He did not ask why Ethan had waited so long or why he had carried those recordings alone. He knew his son had already spent too many years feeling responsible for problems created by adults. After a few moments, Ethan looked at him and asked whether Daniel was angry that he had recorded his mother. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but he kept his voice steady. He told Ethan that he was not angry. He told him that he wished Ethan had never been put in a position where recording anyone felt necessary, but he was grateful that his son had chosen truth instead of fear. Ethan finally told Daniel how the recordings had begun. He described the first afternoon when Vanessa had told him that Daniel would leave them. He explained how confused he felt when his mother spoke kindly in front of others, but became cruel when they were alone. He admitted that he had been terrified the phone would be discovered, especially after Vanessa began talking about court and asking him to say things that were not true. Daniel listened to every word without interrupting. He wanted to take away the years Ethan had lost to worry, but he knew he could not change the past. All he could do was make sure his son understood that he would never have to face something like that alone again. When Ethan leaned against him, Daniel placed an arm around his shoulders and held him quietly while the old phone rested between them. In the weeks that followed, the court's investigation revealed more than Vanessa expected. The recordings were verified, and several of her written claims were found to contradict her own conversations. The child advocate reported that Ethan had been under emotional pressure for a long time, and that he felt safest when he was allowed to speak without being coached or judged. Marcus presented messages, financial records, and school documents showing that Daniel had consistently supported Ethan, attended school events, paid household expenses, and remained involved in his son's daily life. Vanessa's carefully built image began to unravel piece by piece. The court did not treat the situation as a victory for Daniel or a punishment meant to humiliate Vanessa. Instead, it focused on what Ethan needed most: stability, safety, and the freedom to love both parents without being forced to choose sides. The final decision gave Daniel primary custody of Ethan, while Vanessa was granted supervised visitation and required to participate in counseling before any changes could be considered. The house was sold, and the legal process divided their remaining assets fairly. Daniel did not celebrate when he heard the ruling. He felt no joy in seeing Vanessa's face fall or hearing Richard quietly apologize for believing things without asking questions. The only thing Daniel cared about was Ethan. He wanted his son to have a home where he could speak freely, laugh without checking who was listening, and go to sleep without worrying about what tomorrow's argument might bring. He wanted to rebuild the ordinary moments that had been stolen from them. Breakfast before school, drives to basketball practice, quiet evenings with homework spread across the kitchen table, and weekends that did not feel like a battle. Months later, Daniel and Ethan moved into a smaller house on the other side of town. It was not as large as the home they had lost, and the backyard needed work, but it was peaceful. Daniel planted flowers near the front porch because Ethan said the empty space looked sad. They painted Ethan's room together, arguing playfully over colors and laughing when Daniel accidentally spilled paint on the floor. On Saturday mornings, Daniel returned to making pancakes, and Ethan once again stood beside him at the counter, taller now and more serious than he had been as a child, but slowly learning how to relax. Sometimes the old phone still sat in a drawer in Daniel's bedroom. Neither of them used it anymore, but Daniel kept it because it reminded him that truth could survive even when it had been buried under years of fear. Daniel never told Ethan that he had saved him because he knew that was not the right way to see what had happened. Ethan had not been responsible for fixing the family, and he should never have had to protect his father from his mother's lies. But Daniel did tell him something every time the past came up: that being brave did not mean carrying pain alone, and that asking for help was not weakness. As their new life began to settle into something gentler, Ethan started inviting friends over, joining basketball games after school, and talking more openly about the future. Daniel watched him become a boy again instead of a witness, and each quiet day in their new home became proof that peace was not something they had imagined, but something they were finally learning to live with.